Please welcome composer Volker Bertelmann, actor and executive producer Daniel Brühl, actor Felix Kammerer, and writer, director, producer Berger. Welcome, welcome, gentlemen. Edward, when I introduced the film, I mentioned that there has never been a German version of the film. Also, the fact that we're used to war films where it's from the vantage point of the victors and is shown as heroic, and you do none of that. I mean, you show us that war is not heroic, and we see it from the vantage point of the Germans. Can you tell us about approaching the story from that? And also the fact that when he first took over directing the film, the script had been written in English, correct? And you switched it into German.
Yeah, well, I got a call from our producer, Malte, who sits over there, about 3 years ago, who said, would you be interested in making a film about All Quiet on the Western Front? And somehow I felt that was such a good idea, and I was a little bit mad at him because I thought, like, why didn't I have that idea? So, because it felt like it was sitting there, and that it was a story that a lot of times, you know, we grew up on American or British war films, or films in general, and usually when there's a film about war, it comes from England or America. And I realized it's not only because of the financials, because of course you need big actors to finance the film, but it's also because of the stories you're able to tell in America or England. Let's stick to America since we're here. You know, America was roped into both wars against their will and liberated Europe from fascism in the Second World War, and that leaves a very different legacy and a very different, you know, in the generations to come, ability to tell a story about your grandfathers and grandmothers and about heroism. And in Germany, obviously, you cannot tell any story that is associated with pride or honor or heroes in regards to the war. And so I always felt when I watched American or British films that I really enjoyed watching them, but I thought, like, oh, that's like very different. I wouldn't make it that way because I have no, that isn't within me. And so when we took it on, we felt where we come from, all our decisions are going to inform the film, obviously, and hopefully that will make a very different film that might be interesting for, you know, you to watch then, that perspective.
I was struck when I watched the film the first time. The Ukraine war was raging, and I just felt so that all the themes in this movie was so relevant to what's happening today with the rise of nationalism and other movements in Europe. You know, when you were, you know, taking the reins on this project, did you understand that it's so timely what this film deals with?
Well, we obviously didn't know that there would be a war now in Europe. And it's not supposed to be a comment, but when we started it, we did feel there were, you know, there was, you know, a certain government here, there was Brexit, there was, in Europe, there were right-wing voters all over the place. In Hungary, an extreme right-wing government in place, in Poland, in Germany on the rise, in France. And the politicians or populists in those countries they started questioning institutions that brought us peace for 70 years. And in a country, in a continent that is usually torn by war for the last centuries. And it felt that the language that was spoken in the governments sort of permeated to the streets, and there was a sense of aggression and antagonism that was new to us 2-3 years ago. It didn't feel like that 5-10 years ago, and it just reminded us of the stuff we learned in history lessons when we were kids, and how it was 100 years ago, and it didn't feel that different. And so we see now where it led to a few years after. And there was actually really interesting. A couple of days ago, I saw photographs on Instagram by a photographer, Wolfgang Tillmans. He's a German photographer, and he went to the Ukraine trenches, and you put it side by side, it looks exactly the same. 100 years ago to now, nothing has changed.
Daniel, you executive produced the film as well as acted in it. When I was watching the film, I knew I studied the novel when I was in high school, and I was struck by the fact that your side of the story is not in the book, but it adds this historical context. It's an addition that you brought, right, Edward? Yeah. Yeah, can you tell us about the importance of bringing in that historical context to the story?
Yeah, well, as Edward said, the driving force behind this project was Malte Grunert here, the producer who found this project, and I still remember the first conversation we had, because I joined his production company a couple of years ago, and our goal was always to find material that is German but which has an international appeal. So in this case, when he told me there's a script that I found, All Quiet on the Western Front, that is strong, that is really good, and what about if we do it in German? It was a real epiphany. I thought, like, yeah, Jesus, it's the most read book in history. It's a literary masterpiece that has never been done in its original language. So I thought, like, yes, of course, that sounds so compelling. And then I read the script, and already the idea was set that, there was this new storyline, and I found that so bold to, if you touch a holy material like a literary classic like this one, also with a cinematic adaptation, which was a masterpiece, it is very courageous, but good if you're willing to open it up, and if you are bold enough to elevate it, to make something new with it, if it makes sense. And to me, it made total sense when this new storyline was added. Where you see what you just have seen, to have at the end of the film this parallel structure where it goes back and forth between the trenches and the famous peace treaty negotiation in Campania. To me, it made total sense, and I was fascinated, by it, because I realized how little I knew about certain people involved in that peace treaty. For instance, Matthias Erzberger, the character that I play, who was an admirable figure in German history, in German politics, who is actually the only human voice, in that madness, and trying feverishly to sign that peace treaty. So I was immediately, convinced to play the character and to, to be involved in this new adaptation, which I find, which I've found the right approach, to retell this story and not, making a remake of a film and to tell something new, dealing with a classic, which is difficult enough to do, and to see what Edward did with it, and to see what Felix did by playing the lead in it. Really touched me deeply when I saw it for the first time, because again, if you're touching a holy material like the novel and a movie classic, it's impressive to see this result.
Felix, when I introduced the film, I told them this was your first film. You had never been in front of the camera before. I'm amazed by the fact that this is your first film. Tell us about, we watched the downfall of this character. At the beginning, he's so hopeful, full of joy, and then gradually we watch him fall. And tell us about approaching the character, which is so demanding, and how you calibrated that fall of the character.
Well, yeah, it was my very first time in front of a camera, but I have to say, I worked for a few years now in theater, so I'm not new to acting, but I just don't know how to act in front of a camera. But it was just the biggest gift to work with Edward and with all those fantastic colleagues, because I learned by doing, and it took some time, it took some days or weeks, but after all, now I think I really know how to shoot a movie. So that's a gift that I take from this time, of course. Character-wise, it was really interesting approaching this character because of the palette of emotions, because you start with joy and love, and we don't know what Paul had. Maybe he had relationships. What about his family? We don't get to know all those things in the movie, but those were there. So what's inside of him before the disillusion comes and before death comes. And for me, the most interesting part of preparing was how easy it was to go into the emotions at the end, towards the end, until death, because we all know fear and we all know, yeah, we have experienced tragedy and we have experienced sadness, but what most of us can't really, for example, for my part, I can't imagine how it feels to be excited about going to war. Yeah. And that's something you really have to work on to make believable, that you really want to go to war and kill the enemy and be excited. And that's something that took quite a while to get into.
See, I never understood that either, but the first time I was able to imagine it was when I saw you and your colleagues in uniform on a makeup test. And we were about to shoot a movie, and you were all really excited, you know, and you had these uniforms, and you didn't realize, because you didn't see yourself, right? I looked at you, and you were like, we're shooting this movie. And I saw these 4 young kids, basically, or 5 young kids, in these uniforms, and I realized oh, this is what it must have been like. It was like an adventure, you know, going, first of all, you had no news. You had generations before talking about the hero, you know, Germany in the 20th century and 19th century had 3 wars that were won, and won very quickly by their the generation of their fathers and grandfathers. And so they were thinking, you know, we're going to be the same. You know, we're going to inherit this heroism, and there was no news, no television, and so no real sense of the horrors of it. And so seeing you, I realized that's what it must have been like going on spring break, you know, on a holiday to Paris, basically away from your parents for the first time, on a train, paid vacation. That's what it must have felt like. You know?
I want to include Volker. From the get-go, when I saw this film, I was blown away by your score, and not just because you're here, but one of the things that I was so intrigued by, and I'd love to hear about, you tell me about it, is that the sound of the music is it filtered? That it felt like I had a hearing loss when I was watching the movie.
Yeah, you have.
Yeah. Can you tell us about that approach, and how did you arrive at it? And
It was actually, it's totally true. It's actually a filter on, you know, on some of the tracks. I recorded them in full range, and then I put a cutoff filter on it, like a damage of your ear.
why did you do that, and why?
Because I mean, in the beginning, when Edward and me we watched the film in the cinema, and you know, we were not talking a lot about the film. The first thing he was saying to me is, I want to have some work from you that you've never done before, which was very nice, because there was a lot of pressure on my shoulders, you know, when you go into a work and you have to challenge yourself with an attitude like that. That's in the beginning it feels like, oh, I don't know if I can do that. But by hearing, you know, also there was already like temp music in the film that was that had a little bit of that approach of, you know, music that is filtered. And I had the feeling that every time we tried different options with not filtering music, the emotions were too clear. It was too direct, like too sad or too... you know, it didn't had the filter of a kind of. I always had the feeling I need music that is under a carpet. You can lift the carpet up every now and then, and it's like, and then you put the carpet back on, and then you lift it again, and so I think the beginning is a little bit the music without a carpet, because it's like the, you know, like the horn, like a little bit like a war horn, which is done with a harmonium of my grandmother, and it's played through a distortion, so it's it gets very big, but it's an instrument from that time, which was for me important. And at the same time, I think the dimension in the film was always for me the emotional trap that those guys went into with their, you know, with their fun, going on a trip, on a ride.
But you're also able to capture this sense of alienation.
Yes, and at the same time, you have these religious moments where, for me, they are in a way, I had the feeling that they express let's say the limitation of life in a way in time. When you see, for example, the light bulbs going over the battlefield, I had the feeling it needs at that moment a kind of glorification of the landscape, and at the same time while you're feeling that, you're thinking, oh man, I'm just watching the most horrible place, and I'm feeling emotionally touched, and that gives you that creates right away a kind of conflict in you watching that, and that means like you are getting it without a big explanation from, from the music. And I thought always when we talked about music and how it is used, we always wanted to create this, maybe this diversity between, building a kind of trap, an emotional trap.
Yeah, yeah. And Daniel, I mentioned to Edward that I was impressed by your deliberate choice of underplaying the character. And you're subdued in the film, and it's such a stark contrast to everything that is happening, counter to your scenes. Can you tell us about that choice?
Yeah, well, I found, as I said before, the cinematically speaking, that whole idea to have to show such a crucial moment in European and world history, as that signing of the peace treaty in that train, was also such a heavy contrast to the horrors of the trenches. So in a film, to experience that, to go back and forth, which you could either see as a relief, to leave the terror and death and go back to the train. But at the same time, it is so shocking to see how neat everything is, in the train, how clean, the polished uniforms, the polished shoes, and they're having their
China
croissants,
and the croissant,
and then it comes down to a couple of powerful men and a couple of hands and ink and paper, and they decide over the fate of, thousands of young boys, men dying, and there's only one human driving force, again, as I said before, who pushes them and urges them, and what I found interesting is that this man came from Germany's south, a provincial politician who climbed up the ladder and made his way to the high politics in Berlin. But I wanted to capture his German accent from the south. By the way, my wife is from that region, so my dialect coach was my father-in-law. Mm-hmm. I think he's the only one who won't be fully happy with my accent, because, if you are in the US, it's probably the same, if you are from Alabama, or if you're here, exactly. So my father-in-law said, like, it was good, but not quite. But again, I still wanted to because in the South they have this very, I wanted to capture this persistence, and there's a certain softness but determination in the accent, opposed to the, the Prussian machine-like sound of how they talked, the Prussians, the militaries that and a wonderful actor is David Striese, who plays the general, which shockingly, when I last saw the film in Zurich, reminded me of, a Russian man. Because history repeats itself, and I was so shocked by how well David Striese is playing this hardliner, this Prussian, general. So I wanted to make it different and to sound softer, but still being very determined, and that's how,
But did you ever feel guilty that you're eating croissants and sipping from a China, and Felix is knee deep in mud, and
I was tell us.
No. This was It was so funny, because the first time we met is like, I'm as an executive producer on that film. The first time I met the boys was in Prague when I had my first costume fitting. So I was wearing this, pajamas, and I had a little cushion to make myself a bit bigger, because Matthias Erzberger was a bit bigger, and so I was so, and the scenes I knew I had to play were so comfortable in the train. And I came to Prague when they had already been shooting for weeks under terrible circumstances. And I saw you and Albrecht, and I felt so bad. And I had this paternal attitude of, being a bit older than you and being the executive producer. And I think I said something horrible like, "Is the food okay? Are they treating you well?" I felt very bad that I, no, but even more so. I mean, if you have to have in mind that, and that's thanks to the power, the energy that this young man and all the other actors in the trenches, but also Edward and my friend Malte put into this. It was the high peak of the pandemic in Prague. The coronavirus was wild. So it was as if shooting a war movie is not exhausting enough. We had to deal with a pandemic, which was at the time a total nightmare. So I could not believe, actually, as an executive and be slightly out of it, that this whole thing still carried on and could be brought to an end. And that's thanks to, you and this man over there. It's quite remarkable. And again, I only had these couple of days on the train, and I was... other than that, I was sitting in Berlin and thinking like, oof.
It wasn't a pillow. He says it was a pillow. But no, it was interesting to me as well, switching between these two, because I was with Felix, and Felix was, I don't know, crying and shouting and running, and there was big action sequences almost, and then suddenly I work with Daniel, and I was almost shocked of how little there was. It was so quiet and so reduced that sometimes, as a director or something, you question yourself every day. You're like, is this shit what we're shooting? Is this terrible? And should I be doing anything to make it good? And so I just watched Daniel, and I thought, like, he's really good, but it's so reduced, and should he be doing more? And I was in doubt constantly. And luckily I didn't say anything.
No. Jesus.
I just left him alone. I thought, like, well, it's Daniel. He
it's the
probably
first time I hear that.
he probably knows what he's doing. And then I actually learned during watching the edit. Then I had a screening for the first time, and I realized the smartness that you had put into the role of creating that contrast to these guys on the field, of really taking himself back and reducing the role to a minimum, and just sort of stepping behind the role and not being a showy supporting actor in a way. So
I have to ask you about the cinematography. You shoot in large format, and we're normally associate that with landscapes, and then we're in this tight trenches with this wide, large format. Tell us about, which is quite striking. Tell us about that choice.
Well, I really like, the camera is very much determined by what these gentlemen are feeling. So we're always, that was the main goal of trying to put you into the shoes of Felix or Albrecht or Daniel at any given moment, mostly Felix because he's on screen 90% of the time. So I always wanted to put the camera where I felt where it puts you in a position to understand what's inside his stomach and to really go with him. And yet at the same time, when you read Remarque's book, the novel that this movie is based on, the language is fascinating because first of all, it's really modern. It could have been written yesterday. Secondly, it somehow gives a very physical and visceral experience, and yet it's almost written like a journalist. It's sort of in a laconic tone, not emotional, it sort of lets you interpret the emotion into it. And we wanted to try to capture the same, which is a difficult sort of, you have to bridge a gap between putting the audience into his shoes and yet sort of staying slightly back and being slightly observant and just watching him. And so that was maybe the the large format, the spreading the lens and seeing a lot of background, and yet being in his space and trying to follow him and putting the audience into his shoes. Let's say when the tank goes across, we see what he sees. And we also shot the movie with one camera only. Usually I think in these type of movies, you probably put 5 cameras on the battlefield and edit it together. And we really wanted to say, well, it's one hero or one main character, not a hero, but one main character. And we're going to put the camera there, what he sees. And 5 cameras would have, shot 5 different perspectives. This person only has one set of eyes. He's going to see what he sees, and he is your eyes into the movie. And so that camera was always there where he was supposed to be. And so that's why that one camera and sort of putting us into his life.
Felix, tell us about the training that you had to undergo to get ready for inhabiting Paul. Also, the fact that you're Viennese, and you're actually, did you have to get a dialect coach or work on your dialect?
Yeah, I had to prepare quite severely because I realized, there's this moment where you get told you get the role, and then you celebrate, but in the next moment there's this feeling that comes up, and now I have to do this actually, and then you get scared. And then I knew I had dialect coach because when I act, and especially when there are emotional scenes, I tend to switch into my Viennese dialect, which is not strong, but you can hear it if you were German.
Pretty strong.
It's a lie. And so I had a dialect coach, especially a dialect coach for this accent from Osnabrück, which is the city where Erich Maria Remarque came from. And I thought that would fit quite well to base this character, the main character, to base him in Remarque's hometown, language-wise. And then I prepared physically, of course, because I was told by Malte Grunert quite soon, and by Edward, that it will be a challenging task to run across the field all day with mud and with the equipment, which weighed around 40 kilos
And
each
the
day.
weight, the uniform is wet,
Yeah,
which
it
weighs
sucks
you.
up all the water, and you have all the mud on you. And we weighed the costume with the equipment after the first week of shooting, and it weighed more than 40 kilos. And then you run.
How much is in that in pounds? 40 kilos?
80 pounds.
80
Okay.
pounds.
90 pounds. Yeah?
90 pounds, yeah.
Thank you.
And then you run for 12, 14 hours across the field.
And
through
then
the
I
mud.
like to do 17 takes.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Can you run a little bit slower so I can see the tree in the background?
I also read that you kept an Excel sheet for your energy levels.
Oh yeah. You don't know? No. Oh. Well, then I
Let's
tell you
hear
now.
about it.
So I knew it was going to be my first movie. I had no idea how to do it. I needed something to hold on because I'm quite rational, I'm very organized, and I need to know what's going on in every moment. So I knew I had to have some organizing form, especially because we were not shooting chronologically. And if we would start with the very last scene, I'm not used to that because I come from theater, and you start at the beginning and you end in the end, and then it's over. So how do you manage starting, for example, on our very first shooting day with the last 10 minutes of the movie? And then I developed a system of it's an Excel spreadsheet, and it's every scene is listed with multiple energy levels for multiple categories. So I have a category for death wish, killing motivation, pulse, multiple categories, and each category has several levels. And so when I know, we're doing scene 25 today, and afterwards we're going to scene 76. So at first I'm starting at level 12, and then I have to go up on 114, and then start preparing at the end of the scene for the next shooting day, which will start at 65. So you really know how to turn the knobs. You know, how to
So, but Felix, where is this chart while you're acting? Are you like looking at the chart going like, scene 12, level 75?
Yes, exactly. I have it with me all the time. I have my script with me.
I've never heard about this.
Yes.
Yeah.
The sheet is in my script all the time, and when we are doing a scene, I go to my script, I look at the spreadsheet, and I see, okay, so now I have to prepare for the scene that comes after this one. So maybe
Why are you laughing, Daniel?
Yeah. No. It's just it reminds me of Dustin Hoffman and
Marathon
Laurence
Man?
Olivier, but Albrecht Schuch did not say what about acting.
Oh no.
No. But it's I'm amazed.
I'm not acting. I'm calculating.
No.
I do that too. I come in the morning and I say, okay, we're doing level 17 today. And then everybody knows what I'm talking about.
Volker, the music is very deliberate and is also very sparingly used. Can you tell us about how were you able to work that out?
Well, there was a lot of noise in the film, you know, and there were. I mean, when I saw the first time the film, I was thinking the main challenge is actually to find a relation with all the gunfire and the fights, which also means you can only use music in a certain frequency because a lot of, you know, musical elements are covered by gunshots, tanks.
Did you have an Excel sheet tracking the frequencies?
No, but I can correlate with that because I'm very mathematically thinking, and I think sometimes it's a very big help, even though it's only numbers. But I can, you know, I can see a sense behind that. But with music, it's a little bit different. Because what I'm not doing is I'm writing numbers or notes before I'm playing. I'm a person that improvises mostly, and I started actually with this main harmonium theme in the beginning, and I intentionally used 3 notes because I had the feeling I need a motive that is very small, that I can push and, you know, in time, that is a little bit, you know, not connected with the grid. So whenever there is a sentence or there's a gunshot or there's something coming, I can just use that motive, and then I can have a long break, and then I can use the motive again.
And when did you discover that harmonium sound, it felt very industrial, it was like a machine. When?
Because I was sitting, when I came after our first screening, I was sitting behind it. Well, I was thinking that I want to use this instrument because it was sitting in my studio prepared, and I never had a chance of using it in a score. And I felt, because it was normally an instrument that was used in Christian homes, where my family was pretty strongly Protestant, and we had in every family, we had these harmoniums to accompany Bach pieces or chorals. So whenever we were singing together, my grandmother or my mother were playing the harmonium. And what I remember was always that it starts with the feet. It creates this breath, like you hear first the so that the air is pumping through the instrument. And then I have these flaps on the side of the knees that can create a tremolo. but the sound of these flaps are, you know, this noise that comes in when you hear the do do do, and then you hear like this sound of wood. And what I really loved is I used a lot of microphones inside of the harmonium to mic actually all these micro noises, rather than what you normally do. You take all the noises away and you just keep the pure tone. I'm not a big fan of that. I love music that is, in a way, when you, I don't know if you experience that, but when you stand on a, maybe you can do that tomorrow, when you go on a street crossing and you just stand there for 5 minutes and you just concentrate your ears on every sound you hear on the street crossing. At some point you think it's music because there's a rhythm of the car. There are people talking over there. There is a whatever, like another, like a baby crying there. Then birds are whistling over there. But this all together sometimes suddenly creates a syncopated rhythm. And I had the feeling that the harmonium was in itself already enough for creating the machine and the brutality of that deep bass sound. And these 3 notes are nearly in every piece in the score. Even the high violin piece is a piece that is actually created out of these 3 notes. And I was unfolding.
Yeah. Edward, I want to ask you, the book, when you read it, there's one thing in literature to describe violence. In the book, the violence is so harsh and just unforgettable. But then in film, it was necessary for you to show the violence, but at the same time, you don't want to alienate the audience. Can you tell us about your having to navigate, you know, how much to show and how much violence to show and how much restraint, etc.?
It's probably very subjective. Everyone would do it very differently. It's somehow my natural instinct was to do it like this. The book is probably much more violent. It's
Harsher,
actually quite brutal and very, very modern. I was really surprised. I mean, there's scenes, for example, with horses with guts hanging out and crying horses. And if you imagine the sound of crying horses on innocent animals on a battlefield, it's a pretty horrific image. And so, but we felt we had to be as authentic or realistic as possible, because anything else would have felt like propaganda. A war movie is gonna be brutal, so there's no, and also there was another thing that Volker and I had talked about, you know, besides the industrial sound of his music, which, because also that war was like, I mean, a part of the theme is a machine. You know, this young man becomes a killing machine. You know, that's what the story is about. He goes into the war with innocence and enthusiasm and youth, and within 3 days he loses everything of that, and he becomes a beast of survival, because it's going to be, you know, it's either me or him. You know, that's all you care about. It's going to be, you know, I'm gonna have to fight for survival, and you're going to have to kill off any emotion, and you become a machine to survive. And that's what the book is about. So that's what we try to express in the music as well, and so that those machine sounds in the instruments became we welcomed those. So, but yeah, that was the theme. In essence, the theme, very much the theme of the film. Also,
but you were conscious of not alienating. I mean, showing violence, but how was it hard finding the middle ground?
It is hard, because I become a little bit like a machine as well while doing it, because you lose all distance to it, because you watch it and you go, well, I don't feel anything, you know, because it becomes technical, you know, in the end, because I see it 1,000 times, and so I have a a distance to the image, and I go like, well, it's obviously going to be, you know, it's fake blood, and it's a plastic helmet and whatever that he hits him with, so that the other guy can't get. And I see all these things, of course, and I become a little bit distant to the image. And every time I have to, you know, I do screenings for friends, and I realize how do they react, and what should I take out, where should I step back. But I think the thing that most helped us was, I bring it back to the book and the writing style, what I said earlier, that we try to put, like a remark, we try to put you in the shoes of this young man, and yet at the same time, just, you know, don't put the camera too much on it. Just be observant, and let you bring your own emotion to it. And then I think you have a little bit of distance to it as well, that you don't, you know, that you don't run out of the theater and escape the horrors of it.
Well, this is one of the best films of the year, and I'm so honored to have gotten the chance to talk to all of you, and thank you for being here. They actually they just flew in from Europe, all of them, and they're all jet lagged, and so thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for having us.